Please open up to Mark chapter 5. We finished chapter 4 last week. We're going to start at Mark chapter 5, verse 1. Mark chapter 5, verse 1. I've been doing this by sections, and I'm going to keep on doing it that way, except the sections are going to be getting longer here in 5, 6, 7, and 8, chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. So this first section, starting at verse 1, goes down through verse 20. And so I'm going to, in each of these sections, and some of these are pretty long, I'm going to read the section, then we'll come back and discuss some of the details. Okay? Everybody with me? Yeah. Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 1. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain, for he had often been chained hand and foot. But he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus at a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demon begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. We've all heard this story, haven't we? A number of times. It's a famous story. It's found in Matthew and Luke also, but not with this kind of detail here. Okay, let's go back to verse 1. They went across to the region of the Gerasenes. Who's ever heard of the Gerasenes before? Not many people, okay? So I'm going back to my little Bible dictionary here in the back of my Bible, and I want to read to you just a couple of sentences out of it. Gerasenes. The region near the city, Gadara, and that's where they get the name Gerasenes, because there was a town there, and that's a town that hardly anybody's ever heard of. And that name is not even in the Bible at all. And it mentions Mark chapter 5, verse 1, where he cast out from the man the legion of demons. In Matthew, they're not called Gerasenes, they're called Gadarenes. And the region is near the ruins on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, where the coast slopes down by the steep bank into the sea. Now notice how I want to make sure you read this carefully as I was reading to you, where it talks about this drop off here. It's not saying it's a cliff. The pigs didn't run off the cliff and fall down into the water. It's saying that there was a steep decline there. And at the bottom, there wasn't a beach or anything. It went right into the water. Guess what? You can go to that place today. It's still there. And it's on the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee, pretty much straight across from where Capernaum is. And also, what was near this? You pay attention here. There was a graveyard near it, because that's where it says he lived, was in the graveyard. And there's the town, okay? Now, they don't quite know where the town is today. There's a number of ruins. It could be a couple of different places. But back away from a little bit from where the thing goes straight into the sea is a graveyard. I've never been there. I've never been to the Holy Land, but when I was at Lansing at the church over there, there was a couple who went over to Israel, and they had a car and they drove around. And because of this story, they went to that spot to see this, and it's there. It's a steep incline of not 45 degrees maybe, but not quite that. And it goes straight into the water of the Sea of Galilee. You can go see this place today. How about that? How about that? Okay, now if we're reading through this, we've already talked about demon possession. This is one of the worst examples of demon possession pretty much in the whole Bible. And we spent some time on this back in chapter 3, where also Christ kicked out a demon. Sometimes in the translations it's called devils or demons, or here impure spirits. And in this one it's both called demons and impure spirits. And I don't want to go into the same thing that I talked about before, but to just say it in one or two sentences, this happened in the first century. But by the end of the first century, it was done. And it doesn't happen today. And there are people that today want to say it still happens. Do you know what two religious groups still prominently say that demon possession happens today? First of all, the Catholic Church. They don't really advertise this, and I don't know if they... It's not ordaining, but there's a procedure that they go through in the Catholic Church that they can make a person an exorcist, and that's a person to kick out a demon out of a person. And there's been some movies made in Hollywood of this kind of thing, but it's actually a legitimate thing that still happens occasionally in the Catholic Church, that they believe that there are still demons today. The other group of people that believe in this are various Pentecostal churches. And here's where I'd like to tell you a little personal story about that. When I lived in Lansing, I saw a newspaper article about a bunch of Pentecostal churches in Lansing were going to have a big meeting together, and they weren't having it at a church building. They got a cafeteria of a high school that wasn't far from where I lived, a couple of miles away from where I live. And so I looked at what they were going to talk about, and one of the nights they were going to talk about demon possession. And I thought, hey, I want to go hear what this guy's going to say about this. So I did. And I didn't go to talk or anything. I just there to sit and listen, and that's what I did. And I was so surprised at what I heard this fellow up front saying. And all the crowd was saying amen through this whole time and that kind of thing. But he was not saying anything I expected, okay? I was expecting something like demon possession he's talking about, like they talk about in the New Testament, like this guy right here. Exactly, that's what I was expecting him to say. None of that was said by him. What he talked about demon possession was the demon of loneliness. And you need to have God's power to cast out the demon of loneliness. If you're lonely, it's because you have a demon. The demon of your son who's an alcoholic and lives with you and gives you fits. That was a specific thing that he talked about. And how that they needed to pray for the demon of alcoholism to be cast out of the son, and so forth. That was exactly the kind of things that I heard this guy say that was demon possession today. And I thought, wow, didn't get any of that out of the Bible, It was all things that were like mental problems or social problems that if you had, that's a demon. And you get rid of it not by getting your alcoholic son into treatment somewhere. You get it by praying for him for the demon to be cast out of him. I thought, a lot of good that's going to do, But anyway, Okay, there's a little bit more about this that I think would be helpful. Any comments on any of that? I'm not trying to run through this. Yeah.
I would say, maybe sometimes it's the way we change, the way we use words. So now, anything that's a struggle, we may say, I have a demon, and so probably, like you said, the conversation into that, if it's an addiction or a challenge or something you can't overcome in your life, you sort of generically say we have this demon within us.
Yeah. Yeah.
It rules your life. It makes you do things in a different way than just you're drawn or tempted to do something.
Right.
I guess maybe that's the difference. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Well, we know we can have temptations and weaknesses, but we don't believe that there's another being inside us controlling what we're doing. And that's exactly what was happening with this guy. Remember the verse 15. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. This guy's normal now. But before, he wasn't controlling his own life. And in his case, it wasn't one. There was a whole bunch of them in him. Now that's really, really, weird. I never want to see that. Okay, but there's more to it. I want to go back to the very first thing we talked about, the Gerasenes. There's a reason why we've never really heard about these people before, because they're only mentioned like here in one other spot in the New Testament. But why? It's because this was not a town of Jewish people. These were Gentiles, non-Jews who lived here. And there's a little proof of that right here in this story, because in verse 19, he says to this guy who had been demon-possessed, "Go home to your own people." Did you catch that? Now you think, well, who does that mean? That means his family. Oh, no, it means more than that, because look down just a couple of lines later, verse 20. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis. Well, what on earth is the Decapolis? Dec, D-E-C, is a beginning that means 10. A decade is 10 years. Our number system is decimal because it's based on tens. You got that? So what's the Decapolis? The Decapolis was 10 cities that were by the Jordan River. 9 of them were on the east side of the Jordan, and 1 of them was on the west side of the Jordan. Well, what's the point of that? All of those cities were called Decapolis because Jews didn't live there. These were all Gentile people that lived in the Decapolis. When this guy went back to his city, he wasn't going to Jewish people. Now, it doesn't say anything directly about that here, but this is true. Jesus healed a guy who wasn't a Jew. He healed a guy who was a Gentile. Now, that may not sound important to you, because Jesus sent his own apostles and said, just go to the Jewish people. Don't go out, away from Israel. At the beginning, that's what he said to them. But right here, without saying it explicitly, Jesus healed a guy who was a Gentile. He cared about him too. Now you wonder, is it possible that maybe he got in the boat and went to the other side where he knew Gentiles lived? Is it possible he knew that guy was going to be there for him to heal? We don't know. The text doesn't tell us. But he went across and healed that guy. And then he came back across. That's what he did when he was there. Notice also the people that when they found out what Jesus had done, what does it say? Verse 17. The people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. What Jesus had done scared them. These people may have never even heard of Jesus before this happened. But they were terrified of the idea that Jesus could do something to help this guy. They asked him to leave their area. Okay, anyway. Any comments about verses 1 through 20? The healing of the guy that was demon-possessed. Yeah. He was in his right mind, sure. It wasn't the guy. It was the demon telling Jesus this. It says Jesus was talking to the demon. The demon said, don't cast us out. Don't punish us. They weren't saying don't punish the guy. He said don't punish us. And then the demon asked Jesus to send him into the pigs. And Jesus did. But then they ran down and everybody died. The pigs died. Got that? Okay. Did you have your hand up?
I was thinking about the Jews at that time when they were seeing these things. According to the law, you weren't supposed to be with the Gentiles, because you weren't supposed to associate with them. And here he healed them. Well, this is kind of why they were against him, because they didn't understand that he was going to be doing these things to Gentiles, so they just thought it was Jews only.
Right. And also notice this. The guy wanted to come back with Jesus. Jesus was in a boat that was going back across the Sea of Galilee to where the Jews lived. The guy wasn't a Jew. What does Jesus say? No, you can't come with us. But what did he say to him? Go back to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. What did the man do? The man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis, meaning to other Gentiles, not Jewish people, how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. All those Gentiles were amazed. Now, what's the effect of this down the line? It's only going to be about 2 years, maybe, before Jesus is dying on the cross and raised from the dead, and the church is started. And when the church was started, it was not to just Jews. It was also to Gentiles. I think that maybe one of the reasons why this was done was for some of the Gentiles in that area east of the Jordan River to be aware that Jesus was there and he was somebody special. So that when the apostles and other people came along teaching about Jesus, they were more willing to listen. I think that's very possible. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm only over some of the stuff that you said, there was a lot there, but I guess for me personally, why would Jesus clearly tell the disciples that he gave them power to cast out demons and that all believers have the same power? And then, in the instance where the disciples couldn't cast out a demon, Jesus, they asked Jesus, well, why couldn't we cast out this demon? And he said, well, certain demons require prayer.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm a little confused if you're saying, like, collectively, that there's not a belief in modern day demon possession, because what has changed?
Demon possession ended at the end of the 1st century. In the 2nd century, not in the Bible, but 2nd century Christians are writing, and they talked about it had happened, and they always talked about it as happening in the past. And you say, well, then why was it there? Why did it stop? We don't know. That's a good question. Why was it even there to start out with? It's not about it in the Old Testament. It's not about it after the 1st century. And when we were talking in chapter 3 about this, I mentioned that the last time it's mentioned in the New Testament, and it's in the book of Acts. We could go back there and look at that again. Would you like for us to do that for a second? Okay. Turn over to Acts chapter. We won't take a long time on this, but let's do just a little bit more. Acts chapter, it's either 16 or 19. Just a minute, we'll find it. Or both. I think it's both. I'm going to go to 19, 12, and see if that's right. Yeah, Acts 19:12. Now, I could show you some of the ones earlier, because it's in the book of Acts earlier than chapter 19. It's in 15 and 5 and chapter 8 and 16, verse 18, and so forth. But this one in Acts 19:12, and I'll read it to you. Acts 19:12, verse 11. God did extraordinary miracles through Paul, so that even handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched him were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and the evil spirits left them, or demons left them. Okay? Acts 19:12 is the last time in the book of Acts that it mentions anything about demons or evil spirits, and it's the last time in the New Testament. Now, there's a lot of history after Acts 19. A lot of time passes. None of it's mentioned after this. This is the last time it's mentioned in the Bible. And it apparently, by the end of the first century, it was done. Because, again, it's not mentioned anymore in the Bible. And for all that matter, Paul's epistles, a lot of them were written later than this. And he doesn't mention demon possession or anything like that. But in the second century, Christians wrote about it happening in the past, back in the first century, but they said it's not happening now. And the third and fourth century and so on. I don't believe that there's demon possession today, and I've never seen it shown.
After the word confirmed, that was all in it. Prophecy, all these things.
Yeah, we could talk about 1 Corinthians 13, and people argue about that. I agree with you, by the way. I think that's what 1 Corinthians 13 is talking about. I'm not sure if I helped you there. You're
That brought in clarity personally on my own life.
I'm sorry.
I said, I don't think that brought clarity to me based on my own lived experience and things I've seen and experienced, but I appreciate it.
Okay. You've never heard that? I didn't. To me, that's different than say there's no more demons. Remember, a demon possession was not you having evil in your heart or evil in your life. Demon possession is when they possess you and they control what you do. When Jesus cast the demons out of this guy, the demon is sitting there dressed and it says right here, in his right mind. He was normal again. That's not the same thing as a person repenting of their sin and saying, I want to be a better person. We're talking about a personality that controlled another person. That's a mental illness. That's not demon possession. And there are people who are bipolar, and what's another way of saying it? Not bipolar. Bipolar is yes, but manic depressive. Manic depressive. You know, where you got your highs and your lows and like that. I would never want to say to a person who's manic depressive or something like that you have a demon. I'm sorry? Yeah, it's a chemical imbalance. And that's why people take medicine that controls their chemical imbalance, and then they have normal lives. That's not a demon in them.
I'm not sure if I'm right or not. Not, like our body without the soul. Yeah. So the soul goes back to God.
That's what the Bible says.
And it's going to have a new body. Well, I think the demons have to have a body in order to function.
Well, they wanted, if they were going to leave the man, they wanted to go into the pigs. You know. Again, what's the purpose of a demon? What's the purpose of an impure spirit? It was something to hurt people, to control people. And in this guy, they were controlling him. I mean, do you remember what it said back there in Mark about the fellow? He had chains on, and he would break the chains. I'm at the wrong place. Where am I? He would cut himself with stones. He lived in a cemetery with no, he didn't have a house there. He was out in the night at a cemetery. The demon was controlling him. This is not what happens today. Okay, can we go on from here? This is a good discussion. I'm glad we had a discussion like this. Because there are all kinds of people. You can go home today and listen on the radio, and people will talk about demon possession today. But, Okay, the next section actually is the rest of the chapter, verses 21 through 43. I told you these were going to get, longer sections. Well, this is a long section. And there's actually two stories here that are kind of combined together. So I'm going to read the whole thing, and then we'll come back. Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. You with me? Well, just the first sentence. Jesus again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake. Where is he going? He's going west. He's back in Jewish territory. Well, what's in Jewish territory? Synagogues and Jews. So we're going to have to talk about a synagogue here. Okay, verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying." Sorry. "Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. Do you understand cloak? I'm sorry, I'm interrupting myself here. Normal, you had two pieces of clothing in Jewish. One was an undergarment, which was not like our T-shirts and shorts. It was one piece. And then you had an outer garment, which would be heavier and longer. And often your outer garment was also your blanket at night. But that was normal. You had an inner garment and outer garment. So when the cloak is the outer garment, okay? When she heard about Jesus, she touched his cloak because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciple answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." And that's the end of that little part of that story. Verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." The him there is Jairus, the synagogue leader. Don't be afraid, just believe. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Two stories, one inside the other, okay? Okay, let's get started on this. Jesus comes back over on the west side. So there are synagogues there, and this fella comes, and he was a synagogue leader, and he had heard about Jesus, and he knew that Jesus could heal, right? That's why he comes to Jesus. "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Now here's a little interesting thing that you don't catch. This word "healed" in verse 23. Do you know what that word really is? Literally, it's the word saved. And it's the normal word for saved. But you got to understand, if a person falls in the water and somebody jumps in and gets him out, we say today he saved him from drowning. You can use a word 2 or 3 different ways in English. And here the word saved is not saying that she had sins and then her sins went away. It's saying just what the translation says. He was healed. It can also mean like recovered. Or I've had another word, I can't remember it right now. But you see, it's a word, saved. And we're going to run into that word later on. In verse 34, when he heals the woman, verse 34, he said to daughter, your faith has healed you. That's the same word, saved. It doesn't mean the woman had sins. It means that he took away her her condition, her bleeding condition. That's what it's talking about. Okay, anyway, so a large crowd followed, and a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under care of many doctors, and she was getting worse. Now here's something it doesn't say that you need to know. If the woman had this, the woman had this bleeding condition, do you know what that made her to the Jews? Yes, religiously unclean. And what could religiously unclean people not do? Now think about the story. They couldn't touch anybody. People couldn't touch them. She wasn't supposed to be in that crowd. She shouldn't have been there. But she's there anyway. Why? Because she's desperate. And it says there's a big crowd of people there. So she comes through the crowd and she comes up to Jesus. And she knows she's healed before Jesus says she's healed. Verse 29. Immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. She knew right then she was healed. It's down in verse 34 that he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Your faith has saved you." She knew before Jesus said that to her. Oh, by the way, what else could a person who was unclean not do? They couldn't go in the synagogues and worship. This is the Jewish woman who can't worship. They couldn't go in the temple and worship. They were restricted from having any kind of connection with religious Jews. Okay. So anyway, so her bleeding stops. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. Sometimes people get a little hyper about this. Power had gone out from him. So it's like a jug in a jar, stuff in a jar, orange juice, and it leaks out. This happens. How does that happen? Well, Jesus knew, and the people knew that if they could touch his clothing, they might be healed. He had done this before. It had happened before. And she thought, well, maybe, but think about this. She wasn't supposed to touch Jesus. She was unclean. Now, remember when we read the story about the leper? Lepers were religiously unclean. They couldn't go into synagogues. They couldn't be around people. And Jesus comes over, and in that story that we read back in chapter 1, Jesus heals the guy and touches him. And can't touch him. Jesus wasn't supposed to touch him. But he'd already healed him. The guy wasn't sick anymore. Now, it doesn't say that Jesus touched the woman here. It doesn't mention that. And I looked in Matthew and Luke to see if it says it there, and it doesn't say it. But in verse 34, he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." She already knew she was healed, but he's telling her, I'm telling you, you're healed. It's not coming back. You're good. And that woman was free. She could worship again. She could be around people. She could live in a town. She could touch people. How about that? Anyway, the story goes on. Jesus speaking to the guy, Jairus, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? Jesus over here and says to the Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. What do you mean, don't be afraid? They've just told him his daughter is dead. What does Jesus mean when he says, don't be afraid, just believe? You're right. And I think he's also saying, trust me. You came to me because you think I can help. Keep on trusting in me. In other words, they're saying leave him. The other people were saying leave Jesus alone. He's saying it's okay. Stay with me. And then Jesus goes with him. Notice in verse 37, when they came to the house, all the apostles don't go in. Who goes in with him? Peter, James, and John. Now, you got straight who these people are? James here is not the guy that wrote the book of James. This is one of the apostles, okay? And why don't we know about him so much? Because he's the first apostle that gets killed. He's the first martyr. And that happens in, I forget where I wrote that down, but it's in the book of Acts. And he's the brother of John, James and John. And John is the last apostle that dies. His brother James is the first apostle that dies. And John is the last apostle that dies. But this is not the only time that it says he takes these particular three with him someplace. A lot of times he was with the 12, you know. But there's other times in the Gospels that Jesus wanted to be with these three. Why? We have no idea. But he obviously liked them, and he liked them to be around him. And so they're the ones with him, along with the mother and the father, Jesus and the girl. There's 6 people in the room, okay? He comes in the house, commotion, people crying and wailing loudly. Now, why are people in the house wailing? What is wailing, by the way? Anybody know what wailing is? W-A-I-L-I-N-G? Crying out loud. Whoa! Like this. And this is still something that's done in the Middle East when somebody dies. And if you don't have your friends or relatives to come do it, there are paid wailers that you can pay in the Middle East today to come to your house and mourn the death of your person that they maybe never even knew. Paid wailers. It's a legitimate occupation today in the Middle East. It really is. Have you seen it? Do you know about that? Or you just heard about it?
Actually, one of my staff members just sent money because she came back home for the family. So yeah, they're doing it.
Now I'm going to tell you something that's going to surprise you. When I went off to college in Henderson, Tennessee, I realized that the churches in the South were somewhat different than the churches in the North. And this came home to me oh so bluntly when I was at a congregation on a Sunday and they had a funeral in the afternoon. Had church on Sunday morning, the funeral was Sunday afternoon. And I was with the people there and they said, we're going to the funeral, so I went along with them. And when I came in, well, first of all, you got to understand, in Middle Tennessee, everybody smoked. So when I first got there, everybody is outside the church building and they're all smoking. So they all come inside and everybody sits down. And I came in and sat down, and before the service ever started, all the women started wailing. Wah! And I had never heard or seen anything like this in my life. This is an a cappella Churches of Christ, okay? In Middle Tennessee, south of Nashville, about 70 miles. And I listened to them wailing. And then they got up and started the service, and then everybody calm, sits down like this, and they're all cool and calm, and I'm looking around. These people were just hollering just a couple of minutes ago, you know. And it went through the service. When the service was over, they all started wailing again for quite a while. This was their custom in this Church of Christ in Middle Tennessee. Wailing with the dead. That's what it was all about. Okay, I almost didn't tell you that story, but I thought I got to tell them that. So here was wailers, paid or otherwise, that were showing grief for the dead or earning their paycheck. So he took them all out. He took the child's father and mother, and the disciples went up, and the child was. He took them by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Now, do you notice the bracket here, Talitha cum, bracket, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up? Why is that bracket there? What does that mean? We've had this happen before, and I explained this before. It means this is not Jesus talking or the apostles. This is the writer of the gospel, Mark. This is his comment. And what is he doing? He's translating what Jesus said in Aramaic to something that the people speaking and reading Greek would understand. Okay? Remember, I've also said that there are times that there's something in Mark that's not in the other gospels. This business about Talitha cum, that's not in Matthew or Luke. This is something that Mark sticks in. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He, Jesus, gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Now, the give her something to eat is probably something that we might have done too. You know, the girl has been very, very sick for quite a while, and now she was dead. So when she wakes up, they're stunned. They can't hardly think. But think about this. The girl was probably quite hungry because now she's well. But the other thing he says, he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. Why do you think Jesus did that? Could be. I think there's a variety of good answers here. But to me, there's a huge one. Who raises people from the dead? God raises people from the dead. Now, I could be wrong about this. Is there somebody in the Old Testament that raised somebody from the dead? You know, I was going to look for that and I forgot. I can't think of it offhand. Yes, he did. He did raise a kid from the dead. You're right. Yeah. No, Elijah, not Elisha, Elijah. Yeah. And Elijah could do miracles. He really had the power of God to do that. But God was still doing it through Elijah, right? Okay, remember I told you one time about healing, and I said if somebody started healing people in Otisville, what would happen in a day or two? You'd have the town overrun with people. What if somebody in Otisville raised somebody from the dead? What would happen? You would have a mob. You'd have to call out the state police or somebody. This was a huge thing to happen. And Jesus wasn't ready for that knowledge to get out yet because he knew what would happen. This was too big for people to handle at that spot. Okay, now I say at that spot. We're a couple of minutes away from ending. How long has Jesus been through this? See, Mark's pretty short. How long was Jesus with his apostles before he was killed and raised from the dead? More or less about 3 years. We are probably right now at about 1 year. More or less. You get a better handle of the passage of time in the Gospel of John, because John talks about Jesus going up to Jerusalem, and it mentions him going up 3 times, and that's kind of where we get the idea of the 3 years, okay? I'm jumping way ahead and telling you this. I don't think in Mark it ever talks about Jesus going to Jerusalem. So we don't have a clearer way of doing time here. But if you compare Mark with John, you get the idea that this is about 1 year. So some time has really passed now. And there's things that happen. Remember I've said to you there's words here that you got to understand. It's not just words. Well, look at chapter 6, verse 1. Jesus left there and went to his homeland. Just sounds pretty simple, right? There could have been months go by in that one sentence right there. The time is passing, but a lot of times they don't tell you how much time it is. It is time for us to stop. We finished chapter 5. We did a whole chapter today, folks. I think we're probably, and by the way, this chapter had 43 verses. The next chapter, chapter 6, has 56 verses. And I'm hoping to do chapter 6 next week. Not because I want to run through, because it's not many episodes. It's not that many things, and they're long. We're going to be reading a lot more. Okay? Thank you for your kind attention.